If you're looking for a movie packed with adventure, mystery, desert action, and a lead character who seems to find trouble wherever he goes, Sahara is definitely worth talking about. Released in 2005 and starring Matthew McConaughey, Zahn and Penélope Cruz, the movie takes a simple search for a lost historical secret and turns it into a much bigger adventure involving danger, politics, and an environmental crisis. But does Sahara actually live up to the excitement it promises, or does the movie become too complicated along the way? Today, we're taking a closer look at Sahara, its story, performances, action, visuals, direction, and the things that work and don't work about it. So, let's start. Sahara is one of those adventure movies that knows exactly what kind of experience it wants to give you. It isn't trying to be a serious archaeological drama, and it isn't interested in slowing everything down to explain every historical detail. From the beginning, the movie wants to take you somewhere hot, dangerous, ridiculous, and entertaining, with a lot of action in between. What surprised me when I watched it is that underneath all the explosions, jokes, treasure hunting, and desert chases, the movie actually has a pretty strong sense of personality. It feels like an old-fashioned adventure story that has been given a much bigger Hollywood budget. The biggest reason that works is Matthew McConaughey as Dirk Pitt. Before watching the movie, you could easily look at the character and think he's going to be another overly confident action hero who always has the perfect answer. McConaughey plays him with that confidence, but he also gives Pitt enough humor and charm that the character doesn't become irritating. He clearly knows he's good at what he does, and the movie isn't shy about showing it, but he doesn't carry himself like someone who thinks he's better than everyone around him. There is a relaxed quality to his performance that fits the adventurous tone very well. Dirk Pitt is basically the kind of character who seems to have been created for an adventure movie like this. He's an explorer, a treasure hunter, a diver, a pilot, and a man who somehow manages to find himself in situations where most normal people would immediately turn around and leave. The movie doesn't spend a huge amount of time making us believe every part of his background because it understands that the fun comes from watching him actually do these things. McConaughey sells that larger-than-life personality well enough that you don't spend the entire movie questioning how he can possibly survive everything thrown at him. Zahn as Al Giordino is another major reason the movie works. If Pitt were played completely straight, Sahara would probably become exhausting pretty quickly. Zahn gives him someone to bounce off, and their friendship creates a lot of the movie's humor. The two actors have an easy rhythm together. Their conversations feel less like two actors delivering jokes and more like two friends who have spent enough time together to know exactly how the other person will react. That chemistry is important because the movie has a lot going on. There is a missing Confederate ironclad, a treasure hunt, political conflict, environmental danger, deadly enemies, and a separate storyline involving Eva Rojas, played by Penélope Cruz. Without the chemistry between Pitt and Giordino, all of those elements could easily feel like unrelated pieces thrown into the same movie. Instead, their friendship gives the adventure a consistent center. Penélope Cruz brings a different energy to the film. Eva isn't simply there to become Pitt's romantic interest. She is a World Health Organization doctor investigating a dangerous disease spreading through parts of Africa, and her storyline gives the movie a more serious side. Cruz plays her with enough determination that she feels capable of operating independently from Pitt, even though the movie eventually brings their stories together. I think that balance is one of the better choices in Sahara. The movie could have easily made Eva completely dependent on the male characters, but she is introduced with her own objective and her own professional responsibility. Her investigation gives the story a sense of urgency that the treasure hunt alone wouldn't necessarily provide. At the same time, Sahara isn't trying to hide the fact that it is a big, entertaining adventure movie. The desert locations give it a huge visual playground, and the filmmakers make good use of that environment. There are stretches of sand, old machinery, abandoned structures, rivers, caves, vehicles, and plenty of places for characters to get into trouble. The setting isn't just a background. It becomes part of the movie's identity. The title itself tells you what kind of atmosphere you're getting, but seeing the characters actually move through that environment gives the film much of its appeal. The heat, dust, and wide open spaces make the action feel different from the usual city-based adventure movie. Even when the plot gets a little ridiculous, the physical environment gives everything some weight. The production design is another area where the movie gets the adventure atmosphere right. Old ships, historical artifacts, military equipment, and desert locations give the story a sense of history without turning it into a museum tour. The filmmakers clearly wanted the audience to feel like there was something buried beneath the modern world that Pitt and his friends were trying to uncover. And that brings us to one of the movie's biggest strengths, its willingness to be entertaining without constantly apologizing for it. There are plenty of adventure films that become so focused on making their story realistic that they lose the fun. Sahara goes in the opposite direction. It knows its hero is unusually capable. It knows the situations are larger than life. It knows Pitt can walk into an impossible situation and somehow find a way through it. Instead of fighting that idea, the movie builds its entire tone around it. That doesn't mean everything works. There are definitely moments where the movie becomes too exaggerated, and some of the dialogue feels like it was written specifically to sound cool rather than like something people would naturally say. But because McConaughey and Zahn deliver most of that material with a relaxed attitude, the dialogue usually doesn't become as distracting as it could have been. The humor is also important. Sahara doesn't try to be a straight comedy, but there is a steady amount of humor throughout the movie. Most of it comes from Pitt and Giordino's friendship, with Zahn often playing the more openly sarcastic side of the partnership. Their conversations give the movie breathing room between the action sequences. I particularly like that the humor doesn't completely destroy the danger. Characters can joke with each other and then immediately find themselves in a genuinely dangerous situation. That contrast keeps the movie moving. If every scene had the same serious tone, the adventure would become much heavier than it needs to be. The direction by Breck Eisner also fits the material. He keeps the movie moving at a fairly quick pace and doesn't spend too much time sitting in one location. There is always another problem waiting for Pitt and his friends, and the story constantly shifts between investigation, action, humor, and adventure. That pace can also be one of the movie's weaknesses because sometimes it feels like the film is rushing from one big event to the next. There are moments when a character or situation could have benefited from more development, but the movie seems more interested in keeping the adventure alive than stopping to explore every detail. For me, that is something you have to accept if you're going to enjoy Sahara. It works better when you watch it as a big, old-school adventure rather than expecting a perfectly structured thriller. The movie isn't particularly subtle. It wants you to enjoy the characters, laugh at the banter, watch the action, and wonder what they are going to discover next. The story also benefits from the way the historical mystery is introduced. The missing ship gives the adventure a sense of curiosity. Pitt isn't just looking for something because the screenplay needs him to have a mission. There is a genuine feeling that he has become obsessed with finding something that has been missing for a very long time. That obsession is part of what makes the character interesting. McConaughey plays that side of Pitt without making him seem completely obsessed or miserable. For him, exploration is clearly part of his personality. He enjoys the search itself. That's why the character feels more like an adventurer than a conventional treasure hunter. He isn't simply interested in becoming rich. He seems to enjoy the challenge of finding something that other people couldn't find. Steve Zahn's Giordino is there to keep that confidence from becoming too serious. Their friendship also gives Pitt a little vulnerability. When you see the two of them together, it becomes obvious that Pitt isn't operating completely alone. He trusts Giordino, depends on him, and treats him like an equal rather than simply a sidekick. That relationship is probably more important to the movie than it initially appears. Adventure stories need a character who can react to the hero, and Giordino provides exactly that. When Pitt does something reckless, Giordino can question it. When Pitt starts getting carried away, Giordino can bring him back down. And when things become dangerous, the friendship between them makes the situation feel more personal. Penelope Cruz's Eva brings the same kind of balance from another direction. She isn't interested in treasure hunting, and her priorities are completely different. Her concern is the disease spreading through the region, which means her storyline has real consequences for ordinary people. That gives the movie a reason to move beyond the personal adventure of Pitt and Giordino. The combination of the treasure mystery and the medical investigation is ambitious. At times, it works extremely well because the two storylines eventually begin to feel connected. At other times, the movie can feel like it's trying to fit two different adventure films together. Still, I prefer that ambition to a movie that only has one simple objective. Visually, the film also benefits from the contrast between the historical mystery and the modern desert environment. You have old technology, forgotten history, and modern vehicles all existing in the same story. That combination gives Sahara a distinctive look. The action sequences are probably what most viewers will remember, but I think the character chemistry is what keeps the movie enjoyable between those sequences. If you remove the humor and friendship and left only the explosions and chase scenes, the movie wouldn't have nearly the same personality. And that's really my first impression of Sahara. It isn't a movie that asks you to take every detail seriously. It wants to give you the feeling of being dropped into a huge adventure where every discovery leads to another problem. Matthew McConaughey is perfectly suited to that style because he can make an impossible situation feel strangely casual, while Steve Zahn keeps the whole thing from becoming too self-important. There are flaws already visible in the writing and pacing, and the movie occasionally pushes its larger-than-life style too far. But the chemistry between the main cast, the desert setting, the historical mystery, and the straightforward adventure tone make it surprisingly easy to settle into. And once the movie gets deeper into its mystery, the real question isn't simply whether Pitt will find what he's looking for. It's whether the separate problems surrounding him, Eva, and the people they encounter can actually be connected without turning the whole adventure into complete chaos. What I like about Sahara is that the movie never forgets that Dirk Pitt is supposed to be an adventurer first. Even when the story starts becoming more complicated, Matthew McConaughey keeps the character grounded in that easygoing personality. Pitt isn't constantly walking around looking serious or trying to convince everyone that he's the smartest person in the room. He usually seems to enjoy whatever challenge is in front of him, which gives the movie a lighter feeling than a lot of action adventures from the same period. That confidence could easily become annoying, but McConaughey understands that the character needs some humility underneath it. Pitt can make fun of himself, he can listen to Giordino, and he doesn't need every conversation to end with him proving that he's right. Those small choices make him much easier to spend 2 hours with. Even when the situations become ridiculous, you can still understand why the people around him trust him. Steve Zahn is just as important to that balance. Giordino isn't written as a completely independent hero, but he also doesn't feel like a useless sidekick whose only purpose is to react to Pitt. Zahn gives him his own personality, and his timing with McConaughey is probably one of the best things in the entire movie. Their friendship has the kind of relaxed chemistry that makes you believe these two have been through plenty of dangerous situations together before the audience ever meets them. That chemistry becomes especially useful during the movie's action sequences. Pitt might be the person making the big decisions, but Giordino is often right there questioning him, helping him, or simply trying to survive whatever crazy situation they've ended up in. The humor between them makes the danger easier to enjoy because you're not watching two strangers suddenly become partners. You're watching two friends who already know how the other one thinks. The historical side of the story also gives Pitt a reason to keep pushing forward. The mystery surrounding the missing Confederate ship is the sort of premise that feels almost designed for a character like him. It gives him something unusual to chase, and the movie gets a lot of mileage out of the idea that an important piece of history could have disappeared somewhere in a huge and unforgiving part of the world. I wouldn't say the historical material is presented with the same level of seriousness you'd find in a traditional historical film. The movie uses history mainly as the foundation for its adventure. It takes the basic mystery and turns it into something much larger, adding danger, conspiracies, villains, and physical obstacles. That isn't necessarily a criticism because Sahara isn't trying to be a documentary. It is using history as an excuse to send its characters on a huge journey. The desert setting is probably the perfect environment for that kind of story. There is something naturally cinematic about a character trying to find something hidden in a landscape that seems almost endless. The wide shots give the movie a sense of scale, while the closer action scenes remind you how dangerous that environment can become. The production design also helps sell the idea that Pitt is constantly moving between different worlds. Modern vehicles and equipment exist alongside old artifacts and forgotten technology. The movie wants the audience to feel that the past is still physically present in the places Pitt is exploring, and that gives the adventure a little more personality than a standard treasure hunt. Then there is Eva Rojas, and I think her storyline is what keeps Sahara from becoming completely self-contained around Pitt. Penelope Cruz plays Eva as somebody who has a very different reason for being in the region. She isn't looking for adventure. She is there because she believes something serious is happening to the local population, and her investigation gives the story a real-world consequence. Cruz brings enough seriousness to the role that the movie's tone changes whenever Eva's investigation becomes the focus. That contrast is useful because Pitt's side of the story can sometimes feel almost like a fantasy, while Eva is dealing with something that could actually affect a large number of people. Her character also gives Pitt somebody who isn't immediately impressed by his personality. That is important because if every character automatically liked Pitt, the charm would become repetitive. Eva is more focused on her own work, and she doesn't have much patience for unnecessary distractions. Cruz and McConaughey have a good contrast because Pitt approaches situations with humor and confidence, while Eva is usually thinking about the consequences. Their chemistry isn't as effortless as the friendship between Pitt and Giordino, but I think that's appropriate. They aren't supposed to feel like two best friends. There is an attraction between them, but there is also a difference in personality and priorities. Pitt likes taking risks because that's part of who he is. Eva is more cautious because she understands that the situation around her has consequences for other people. That difference gives their relationship something to work with beyond the usual action movie romance. At the same time, the romantic side of the movie isn't particularly subtle. There are moments when you can clearly see the screenplay moving the two characters toward each other because that's what an adventure movie like this is expected to do. It works well enough, but I think the friendship between Pitt and Giordino is much more convincing. The villains are another part of the movie where the larger-than-life approach becomes obvious. They are not particularly complicated characters, and the movie doesn't spend a lot of time trying to give them deep psychological motivations. They exist mainly to create obstacles for the heroes and to raise the danger as the story progresses. Normally, that would be a major weakness for me, but in Sahara it doesn't bother me as much because the movie isn't selling itself as a character study of the villains. The real focus is on Pitt, Giordino, Eva, and the mystery they're trying to understand. The antagonists are there to make their journey harder. Still, some of the villains are much more memorable visually than emotionally. You remember what they do and the situations they create, but you don't necessarily walk away thinking much about their personalities. The film could have benefited from giving at least one major antagonist more depth. The pacing is generally energetic, although I did notice that the movie sometimes feels like it is carrying too many storylines at once. There is the historical mystery, Eva's investigation, Pitt and Giordino's adventures, the political conflict, and the larger danger developing around them. Most of these threads eventually connect, but the movie occasionally feels like it is rushing to keep all of them moving. That is probably one of the consequences of adapting a large adventure novel into a feature film. There is clearly a lot of material here, and the movie wants to preserve the feeling that Pitt is part of a much bigger world. The benefit is that the story rarely feels empty. The downside is that some characters and ideas don't receive as much development as they could. The action is another area where the movie goes big. Vehicles get destroyed, characters end up in dangerous locations, and Pitt repeatedly finds himself in situations where common sense would suggest leaving immediately. The choreography isn't always realistic, but realism isn't really the point. The action is designed to keep the adventure moving and to give Pitt opportunities to demonstrate why he's such a capable character. McConaughey is convincing in those moments because he doesn't overplay the physical side. He looks comfortable in the action, but he doesn't turn Pitt into a superhero. There is still a sense that he is relying on experience and confidence rather than having completely impossible abilities. The same goes for Zahn. Giordino isn't suddenly transformed into an action hero every time a fight starts. He remains the more ordinary member of the partnership, which makes his reactions funnier and more relatable. When Pitt decides to do something insane, Giordino's response often feels like the audience's response. The dialogue between them is another reason the movie maintains its energy. Some jokes work better than others, and there are definitely lines that feel dated now, but their friendship makes even the weaker material easier to accept. They have enough chemistry that you can enjoy the interaction even when the actual joke isn't particularly clever. The movie's soundtrack also contributes to the adventurous tone. It doesn't dominate the film, but it gives many scenes the kind of energetic atmosphere you'd expect from a big-budget adventure. The music knows when the movie is supposed to feel exciting and when it needs to become more serious. Visually, the film has aged fairly well in some areas. The practical locations and large-scale environments give it a physical quality that helps the adventure feel real. Some visual effects are more noticeable now, especially when the movie becomes extremely ambitious, but the desert photography and production design still provide plenty of memorable imagery. I also think the movie deserves credit for making the desert feel like a genuine obstacle rather than simply a beautiful background. Heat, distance, water, transportation, and isolation all matter. The characters aren't just walking through a postcard. The environment constantly affects what they can do. That makes the adventure more convincing because even though the plot itself becomes exaggerated, the physical world still has rules. Pitt can be incredibly resourceful, but he still has to deal with the limitations of the environment around him. Another thing that works is the movie's willingness to switch between serious and funny moments. It doesn't always get that balance perfect, but the basic idea is right. If the film stayed serious for its entire runtime, the larger-than-life adventure would probably become exhausting. If it treated everything as a joke, Eva's storyline and the danger facing the people around her wouldn't have enough weight. The best scenes find a middle ground. Pitt can make a joke without destroying the tension, and the characters can be in genuine danger without suddenly behaving like completely different people. That consistency is one of the reasons McConaughey works so well in the role. His version of Pitt feels like the same person whether he's joking with Giordino, talking to Eva, exploring something historical, or trying to escape from a dangerous situation. The tone around him may change, but the character doesn't. And that is probably the most important quality for a movie like this. Sahara needs a central character who can carry all of its different tones without making the movie feel disconnected. McConaughey does that surprisingly well. There are certainly weaknesses in the screenplay, particularly when it comes to how much information the movie has to move through. Some developments feel convenient, and some characters could have used more depth. But the movie has enough energy and personality that those problems don't completely stop it from being enjoyable. At this point, what keeps me interested isn't whether every part of the story is perfectly realistic. It is the combination of the characters, the locations, the mystery, and the sense that another ridiculous situation is always waiting around the corner. Sahara is basically asking you to go along for the ride, and if you accept that from the beginning, the movie becomes much easier to enjoy. It's a big, loud, occasionally silly adventure, but it has enough charm in its cast and enough visual variety to make the journey worthwhile. One of the reasons Sahara remains fairly easy to watch is that it understands the importance of having a lead character who can carry a movie even when the screenplay becomes a little excessive. Matthew McConaughey does exactly that with Dirk Pitt. There is a natural confidence in the performance, but it never feels like McConaughey is trying too hard to make Pitt look cool. He seems comfortable with the character, and that relaxed quality helps the movie maintain its adventurous tone. Pitt is also more likable because the movie doesn't make his confidence entirely self-serving. He is interested in history, he enjoys exploring, and he clearly has a strong sense of loyalty toward the people around him. He isn't simply chasing a reward for himself. That makes his obsession with the missing ship easier to understand because it feels like part of his personality rather than just a plot device. Steve Zahn's Al Giordino continues to be the perfect contrast. Zahn has a different comedic rhythm from McConaughey, and that difference is what makes their scenes work. Giordino is often the person who questions Pitt's decisions, but he isn't written as somebody who constantly complains. There is genuine friendship between them, and you can tell that Giordino has enough confidence in Pitt to follow him into situations that most people would avoid. Their friendship is one of the few elements that makes the movie feel grounded. The larger story can become pretty wild, but the relationship between these two characters remains straightforward. They trust each other, they argue, they joke, and when things get dangerous, neither one simply abandons the other. That gives the action a little more emotional value because the audience actually cares about what happens to both of them. Penélope Cruz's Eva is important for a different reason. Her storyline gives the movie a sense of urgency that Pitt's treasure hunt doesn't have on its own. Eva is investigating a disease outbreak, and her concern is about people who may not even know what is happening to them. Cruz plays her seriously enough that the medical side of the story doesn't feel like another joke. I think the contrast between Eva and Pitt is one of the more interesting aspects of the movie. Pitt approaches danger almost like a challenge. Eva sees danger as something that can have consequences for real people. Neither character is completely wrong in their attitude, but they are looking at the same environment from very different perspectives. That difference also makes their relationship more enjoyable than it would have been if they were immediately attracted to each other and agreed on everything. Eva isn't particularly interested in Pitt's adventurous personality at first, and Pitt has to adjust to the fact that she isn't impressed by his confidence. Their interactions have enough friction to keep them interesting. The romantic element isn't the strongest part of the movie, but it works because McConaughey and Cruz have enough screen presence together. They look like they belong in the same adventure movie, and their conversations have a natural rhythm. The problem is that the screenplay sometimes treats the romance as something that has to happen rather than something that develops completely on its own. That isn't unusual for this kind of Hollywood adventure. The movie has a lot of things it wants to accomplish, and romance is one of them. Because the central friendship is stronger, though, I found myself more interested in Pitt and Giordino's relationship than Pitt and Eva's. Another area where the movie succeeds is the physical scale of the adventure. The locations give the filmmakers plenty of opportunities to create scenes that feel larger than life. There is a real sense of distance in the desert, and that makes the characters' journey feel like something they actually have to survive rather than simply a series of locations on a map. The production design also deserves credit. There is enough detail in the vehicles, equipment, historical objects, and environments to make the world feel lived in. The movie doesn't look like it was shot entirely on a soundstage. Even when the story becomes exaggerated, the physical world around the characters gives it some credibility. The historical elements are especially useful because they give Pitt's character a reason to exist. If the movie were only about stopping a villain, Pitt could easily feel like another generic action hero. His interest in lost history makes him more distinctive. He is curious, and that curiosity is what drives much of the adventure. I also like that the movie doesn't spend too much time explaining every piece of history. It gives the audience enough information to understand why the mystery matters and then lets the characters investigate it. That keeps the story moving. A more serious historical movie might spend much longer exploring the background, but Sahara is more interested in what the characters are going to do with that information. The screenplay is at its best when it follows that simple approach. It becomes weaker when it tries to make every development feel enormous. There are moments where the plot seems determined to raise the stakes again even though the previous problem was already enough to keep the audience interested. That is one of the movie's main pacing issues. Instead of allowing certain discoveries to have time to breathe, the story often moves immediately toward the next obstacle. This keeps the film energetic, but it also means that some moments don't have as much impact as they could have. Breck Eisner's direction helps compensate for that by keeping the movie visually active. There is usually something happening in the frame, whether it's a vehicle moving through the desert, characters searching an old location, or Pitt and Giordino trying to escape another dangerous situation. The movie rarely feels visually empty. At the same time, the direction doesn't completely abandon the characters. There are enough quieter moments between the action sequences to remind us who these people are. Those scenes are important because without them the movie would become a collection of stunts. The humor is another thing that keeps the quieter moments enjoyable. Some jokes are obviously designed for the audience, but others come naturally from the personalities of Pitt and Giordino. Steve Zahn is particularly good at reacting to the absurdity around him. He can make a simple expression funny without needing a big punchline. McConaughey's humor is more relaxed. Pitt rarely seems bothered by the fact that things are going wrong, which makes him fun to watch. Even when he is in trouble, there is usually a sense that he is already thinking about how to get out of it. That confidence is probably what makes the character work for the entire movie. If Pitt constantly panicked, the story would feel much more stressful. Instead, he tends to approach danger with curiosity and determination. It gives the movie the feeling of a classic adventure where the hero is always looking for the next challenge. There are moments, however, when the movie pushes that confidence too far. Some of Pitt's decisions are so reckless that you can see the screenplay protecting him from consequences. That is one of those things you either accept as part of the genre or find frustrating. I mostly accepted it because the film establishes early that Pitt is supposed to be unusually capable. The villains, on the other hand, don't receive the same level of character development. They mostly function as threats, and while that keeps the story simple, it also makes them less memorable than the heroes. The movie spends much more time establishing Pitt and Giordino's personalities than it does exploring the people standing against them. I don't think Sahara needed a deeply complicated villain, but a little more motivation would have helped. The best adventure movies usually have an antagonist who feels like a genuine obstacle rather than someone who exists only because the heroes need somebody to fight. The environmental storyline also gives the movie more weight than a simple treasure hunt. Eva's investigation brings in the idea that the consequences of what is happening extend beyond Pitt's personal adventure. That gives the movie a larger sense of purpose, even if the screenplay doesn't always explore that side as deeply as it could. Cruz handles the serious material well. She doesn't try to compete with McConaughey's charm, and that is the right decision. Eva has a different personality, and her seriousness gives the movie some balance. When the two characters are together, their differences become part of the entertainment. The visual contrast between them also works. Pitt seems comfortable in the desert and in unpredictable situations, while Eva is more focused on her medical investigation. Neither character completely belongs to the other's world, and bringing them together creates a useful tension. Another strength is the movie's sense of movement. Even when the plot is complicated, the characters are usually pursuing something specific. Pitt wants answers about the missing ship. Eva wants to understand the disease. Giordino wants to help Pitt while staying alive. Those objectives keep the story from becoming completely directionless. The problem is that the movie sometimes introduces new information before we've had enough time to appreciate the previous development. This can make the story feel crowded. If you aren't paying attention, it would be easy to lose track of which mystery is connected to which character. Still, the overall structure remains understandable because the performances keep the audience anchored. Whenever the plot gets complicated, Pitt, Giordino, and Eva remain recognizable personalities. You know what motivates them even when the details of the larger conspiracy become more difficult to follow. That is probably why I would describe Sahara as a character-driven adventure disguised as a big action movie. The explosions and chases are important, but the movie would not be nearly as enjoyable without the personalities behind them. Matthew McConaughey gives Pitt enough charm to make the exaggerated material believable. Steve Zahn makes the friendship entertaining. Penélope Cruz gives the serious storyline some credibility. Together, they create a combination that is stronger than the individual parts of the screenplay. And that's where the movie starts to become more enjoyable than its reputation might suggest. It has plenty of flaws, and I wouldn't pretend the script is perfectly written, but there is a genuine sense of fun in the way the cast approaches the material. Nobody seems embarrassed to be making an old-fashioned adventure movie. That sincerity matters. Sahara doesn't constantly wink at the audience and tell us that the story is ridiculous. It simply plays its adventure straight enough for us to enjoy it while still allowing the characters to have fun with the situation. For me, that is the balance the movie gets right most often. It knows when to be serious, when to be funny, and when to simply let the setting and action carry the scene. It doesn't always make the transition perfectly, but when everything comes together, the result is exactly what I want from this type of movie. One thing that becomes more noticeable as Sahara continues is how much of the movie depends on the chemistry between its main cast. The plot has plenty of material to work with, but the actual reason the film remains enjoyable is that the actors make the characters feel like people you want to spend time with. Matthew McConaughey, Steve Zahn, and Penélope Cruz all bring different energy to the movie, and that difference helps prevent the adventure from becoming monotonous. Matthew McConaughey's performance as Dirk Pitt is probably the biggest reason the movie has the tone it does. This was a period when McConaughey was especially good at playing confident, charming characters, and Pitt fits that screen presence almost perfectly. What makes the performance work is that he doesn't seem desperate to prove how cool the character is. Pitt walks into dangerous situations with the same relaxed confidence he has during normal conversations, and McConaughey's delivery makes that attitude feel natural. There is also a physical confidence to his performance. Pitt is supposed to be experienced at diving, exploring, driving, fighting, and surviving difficult situations, so the actor has to make those abilities believable without turning him into a superhero. McConaughey mostly manages that balance. He looks comfortable during the action, but his performance still has enough personality that Pitt doesn't disappear underneath the stunts. Steve Zahn provides the perfect counterbalance. Giordino is more openly comedic, but Zahn never makes him feel like a cartoon character. There is a genuine friendship underneath the jokes, and that makes the relationship much more entertaining. You get the impression that these two have spent years getting themselves into trouble together, which makes their conversations feel more natural. Zahn's timing is especially good whenever Pitt starts doing something reckless. He doesn't need a long speech to communicate that he thinks Pitt is crazy. Sometimes the reaction itself is enough. That is one of the reasons their friendship works so well. Pitt is the confident one who sees an opportunity, while Giordino is usually the person who understands how dangerous that opportunity actually is. The movie also gives Giordino enough moments of competence that he never feels completely dependent on Pitt. He can handle himself, he understands the equipment, and he is clearly experienced. That matters because a friendship between a hero and a sidekick is much more believable when the sidekick actually brings something to the partnership. Penélope Cruz brings a different kind of strength to the movie. Eva Rojas is surrounded by people who are willing to take risks, but her motivation comes from something more serious. She is investigating a disease outbreak, and Cruz plays her with enough determination that you believe she would continue the investigation even if Pitt weren't there. That is important because the romantic storyline could have weakened Eva's character if the movie had simply turned her into Pitt's companion. Instead, she retains her own purpose. She has professional knowledge, she understands the seriousness of what is happening, and she doesn't automatically accept Pitt's approach to danger. The chemistry between Cruz and McConaughey is enjoyable, although I think the movie is stronger when it focuses on adventure rather than romance. Their characters have enough differences to create some fun exchanges, but the relationship sometimes feels like a required part of the genre rather than the emotional center of the story. Still, Cruz gives Eva enough personality that she never feels like an afterthought. She is serious without being completely humorless, and she can hold her own in conversations with Pitt. That makes the relationship more balanced. Another major strength is the movie's use of locations. The desert isn't just there to make the movie look exotic. It influences the way characters move, the vehicles they use, and the dangers they face. There is a physical difficulty to being in such an environment, and the movie uses that to create tension. The wide shots are particularly effective because they make the characters look small against the landscape. That gives the adventure a sense of scale. You can understand why finding something in such a huge area would be difficult, and you can also understand why getting lost or stranded would become a serious problem. The locations also help distinguish Sahara from action movies set primarily in cities. There aren't endless buildings or crowded streets where characters can disappear. Instead, the environment often feels open and exposed. That changes the way the action is presented and gives the film its own visual identity. The production design supports this nicely. Historical objects and old machinery have enough detail to make them feel like real discoveries rather than simple props. The movie wants you to believe that Pitt is fascinated by these things, and the physical detail helps sell that obsession. The historical mystery itself is another area where the movie has a good premise, even if the execution isn't always perfect. The idea of a lost Confederate ship ending up somewhere far from where anyone expects it gives the adventure a strong starting point. It is the kind of mystery that immediately creates questions without requiring a complicated explanation. The movie's problem is that it sometimes adds so many other elements around that mystery that the original discovery can feel less important. There are political developments, environmental concerns, villains, and multiple action sequences competing for attention. The story has plenty of ambition, but that ambition occasionally works against the simplicity that makes the basic premise appealing. This is where the pacing becomes a little uneven. The movie moves quickly, which is good for an adventure, but some sections feel like they are moving quickly because the screenplay needs to reach the next major event. A few scenes could have benefited from more breathing room. At the same time, I don't think slowing the entire movie down would have been the right solution. The energetic pace is part of its identity. The better solution would probably have been to remove some unnecessary material and give the strongest elements more space. The humor helps with this because it gives the audience small breaks between the heavier sections. Pitt and Giordino can joke around, and that allows the movie to reset before another major development. The humor isn't always brilliant, but the characters' personalities make most of it enjoyable. The film also has a nice sense of adventure because the characters are constantly discovering something new. Even when you know the general direction of the story, there is still curiosity about what they are going to find next. That feeling is essential for a treasure hunt movie. I think Breck Eisner's direction deserves credit for maintaining that curiosity. He doesn't make every discovery feel like the greatest moment in movie history, but he keeps enough visual energy around the characters that the world remains interesting. The action sequences are also staged with an emphasis on movement. Vehicles, boats, aircraft, and desert terrain all become part of the action. That variety prevents the movie from relying on the same type of chase over and over again. Some of the effects have aged better than others, but the large-scale sequences still have a physical quality that I appreciate. The movie feels like it wants to show us something rather than simply cutting rapidly between close-ups. That is particularly noticeable during the vehicle sequences. The desert provides room for the action to become genuinely large, and the filmmakers take advantage of it. You get a sense of speed and distance, which isn't always easy to achieve in action movies. The movie also understands that action works better when the audience knows why the characters are running, fighting, or escaping. Pitt and Giordino aren't just involved in random set pieces. Their actions are usually connected to the larger investigation or to their attempt to stay alive. The villains remain one of the weaker parts of the movie, though. They provide enough danger to keep the story moving, but they don't have the same personality as the heroes. I never felt that the film was particularly interested in exploring who they were beyond their role in the conflict. That isn't fatal because the movie's emotional investment is clearly in Pitt, Giordino, and Eva, but it does make some of the confrontations feel more mechanical than personal. The environmental side of the story gives those confrontations a little more significance. Eva's investigation isn't just about her own curiosity. There are people being affected, and that raises the stakes beyond Pitt's personal adventure. Cruz gives those scenes enough seriousness that they don't feel completely disconnected from the rest of the movie. I also appreciate that Eva isn't portrayed as somebody who needs Pitt to explain everything to her. She has her own expertise, and that gives their interactions a little more balance. Pitt may be the adventurous specialist, but Eva is the person who understands the medical side of the situation. That difference between their areas of knowledge is one of the better details in the screenplay. Instead of making Pitt an expert at everything, the movie allows other characters to know things he doesn't. Giordino has a similar function. He understands Pitt better than most people do, and that gives him value beyond simply being funny. He can recognize when Pitt is taking a risk and can often predict what Pitt is going to do next. Those relationships are what give the movie its human side. Without them, the historical mystery and environmental crisis would simply be plot mechanics. Another thing I noticed is that McConaughey seems to understand exactly how much charisma the movie requires. He doesn't play every scene at maximum intensity. Sometimes Pitt is almost casually confident, and that makes the more serious moments stand out. If he were constantly shouting or trying to look heroic, the character would become tiring. Instead, there is a looseness to the performance that fits the movie's old-fashioned adventure style. The same can be said for Zahn. He doesn't try to compete with McConaughey's screen presence. He complements it. That is why their scenes feel so easy. By this point, I think the biggest strength of Sahara is clear. The movie is fun because the people inside it are fun to watch. The screenplay has problems, the villains could be stronger, and the story sometimes feels overcrowded, but the central cast gives the film enough personality to overcome a lot of that. It isn't the kind of movie I would recommend because every element is perfectly constructed. I would recommend it because it captures the feeling of a big adventure. It has attractive locations, charismatic actors, a mystery involving lost history, action, humor, and enough danger to keep the story moving. And even when the movie becomes a little too much, McConaughey's Pitt keeps it from becoming completely ridiculous. He plays the character as someone who genuinely enjoys this life, which makes the adventure feel like something he would actually choose rather than something the screenplay has forced on him. That is a surprisingly important distinction. Pitt isn't just surviving the adventure. He seems to be having the time of his life while doing it, and that attitude is exactly what allows the audience to enjoy the ride with him. As the movie moves further into its central conflict, I think Sahara becomes more interesting because the separate elements of the story start working together instead of feeling like completely different adventures. The lost ship, Eva's investigation, Pitt's obsession with history, and the danger surrounding the people in the region all begin to feel connected. The screenplay still has a tendency to pack too much into certain sections, but the overall direction of the story becomes easier to appreciate once those pieces start coming together. What keeps the movie enjoyable through all of this is still the cast. Matthew McConaughey doesn't change the basic personality of Dirk Pitt just because the situation becomes more serious. That's a good choice. Pitt remains confident and adventurous, but there is more urgency behind his actions because the stakes are no longer limited to finding something interesting from the past. McConaughey is particularly effective at making Pitt feel like somebody who is comfortable around danger without making him completely fearless. There is a difference between being brave and behaving as if nothing can hurt you, and the performance generally stays on the right side of that line. Pitt knows when something is dangerous, but his experience gives him the confidence to keep moving instead of freezing. That also makes his friendship with Giordino more convincing. Steve Zahn doesn't suddenly become a completely different character when the situation gets serious. He remains the person who can bring some humor into the scene while still understanding that things have become dangerous. The friendship has enough history behind it that their loyalty feels natural. I think Zahn's performance is one of the reasons Sahara hasn't aged into a completely generic action movie. There are plenty of adventure films where the hero is surrounded by supporting characters who exist only to explain things or provide occasional jokes. Giordino feels more important than that. He has a personality that exists even when Pitt isn't around. The same is true of Eva. Penelope Cruz's character has a professional purpose that remains important to the larger story. She isn't simply waiting around for Pitt to finish his adventure so that they can have a romantic moment. Her investigation continues to matter, and Cruz gives the character enough seriousness to keep that storyline from feeling like an unnecessary subplot. I also think Cruz handles the more emotional material better than some of the dialogue deserves. There are moments where the screenplay gives her very direct lines about the seriousness of the situation, but she doesn't overplay them. She keeps Eva focused and professional, which makes her feel more believable. The contrast between Eva and Pitt continues to be useful. Pitt is naturally drawn toward mystery and discovery, while Eva is focused on consequences. He sees a problem and wants to figure it out. She sees a problem and wants to know how many people are going to be affected by it. Those perspectives aren't identical, and that gives their partnership some substance. The movie's environmental theme is also more effective because it isn't completely separated from the adventure. The disease isn't just background information. It gives the story a reason to move beyond Pitt's personal interests. Suddenly, the things he is discovering have consequences that extend far beyond his own curiosity. That raises the stakes without changing the basic tone of the film. Sahara still wants to be entertaining, but there is now a stronger reason for the characters to keep going. This is also where the movie's villains become more important, although I still think they are one of its weaker elements. They are effective enough at creating danger, but the screenplay doesn't give them the same depth that it gives Pitt, Giordino, or Eva. Their actions matter to the story, but their personalities aren't nearly as memorable. I don't necessarily need every adventure villain to have a tragic backstory, but a stronger antagonist would have made the conflict more personal. Pitt is charismatic, Giordino is funny, Eva is serious, and the villains often feel like they're there because the story requires someone for the heroes to oppose. The movie does compensate for that by giving the environment itself a threatening quality. The desert, abandoned locations, old machinery, and long distances all create physical obstacles. Even when the villains aren't particularly interesting, the characters still have plenty to deal with. The visual side of the film continues to be one of its strengths. The desert photography gives the movie a large scale, while the production design provides enough detail to make the historical side of the story convincing. There is a sense that the characters are uncovering something that has been forgotten for a long time. The old-fashioned adventure atmosphere is probably what I enjoy most about the movie. It reminds me of the kind of films where the hero travels from one strange location to another, follows clues, discovers hidden history, and ends up in a much bigger problem than expected. The movie doesn't try to make that style modern by removing all of its traditional elements. Instead, it embraces them. Pitt is charming, the supporting characters have distinct personalities, the villain is dangerous, the locations are exotic, and the mystery keeps getting bigger. That can make some parts feel dated, particularly the humor and certain romantic interactions, but it also gives the movie its personality. I would rather watch a film that commits to its style than one that seems embarrassed by what it is. The action also benefits from this approach. There is a sense of physicality to many of the sequences because the characters are interacting with real vehicles and locations. The movie uses boats, cars, aircraft, and desert terrain to create variety. Some of the action is obviously exaggerated, and there are moments where Pitt seems to survive situations that would be extremely difficult for anyone. But again, the film establishes its rules early. It isn't asking you to believe that Pitt is an ordinary man who suddenly becomes an action hero. He's presented as somebody with unusual experience, so his ability to survive becomes part of the entertainment. McConaughey's performance helps sell that because he doesn't seem surprised by his own abilities. Pitt doesn't celebrate every successful escape. He simply keeps moving. That makes him feel more like an experienced adventurer than somebody who is constantly trying to show off. Steve Zahn provides the opposite reaction. Giordino often looks like he can't believe Pitt has decided to do whatever ridiculous thing comes next. That difference creates some of the movie's best humor. Their relationship also gives the action some emotional stakes. When Pitt and Giordino are separated or placed in danger, you understand that they aren't simply partners because the screenplay says so. Their friendship has been established strongly enough that you care about both of them. The movie's pacing is still uneven in places. Some sequences move so quickly that the emotional consequences don't have enough time to register. Then other sections slow down slightly, usually when the characters are investigating or talking, before the next major action sequence begins. I don't think this destroys the movie, but it does make the structure feel a little less smooth than it could have been. A tighter screenplay could probably have removed some of the unnecessary material and given the strongest developments more room. The dialogue has the same problem. Some conversations sound natural because the actors have strong chemistry, while others sound like movie dialogue designed to deliver information or a joke. It's one of those films where the performances often make the writing better than it looks on the page. That is particularly true for McConaughey and Zahn. Their timing allows them to turn ordinary lines into something more entertaining because you believe these characters actually enjoy talking to each other. I also appreciate that Pitt and Giordino aren't constantly competing for attention. Their friendship doesn't depend on one person always being smarter or funnier than the other. Pitt usually takes the lead, but Giordino still contributes, and Pitt respects him. That respect is important because it makes Pitt more likable. He isn't the kind of hero who treats everyone else like an idiot. He can be arrogant about his own abilities, but he doesn't need to put other people down to establish his confidence. Eva also benefits from that quality. Pitt doesn't simply dismiss her because she has a different approach. He eventually recognizes that she knows things he doesn't, and their partnership becomes more balanced because of that. The romantic side of their relationship remains one of the less developed elements for me. There is enough chemistry to make it believable as an adventure movie romance, but the film doesn't spend enough time exploring why these two people would genuinely connect beyond the circumstances bringing them together. That's not necessarily a major problem because romance isn't the main reason to watch Sahara. The adventure and friendship are much stronger. But if the movie had spent a little more time developing Eva and Pitt as people rather than simply adventure partners, the emotional side of their relationship could have been stronger. The soundtrack and editing continue to support the fast-moving tone. The film doesn't sit in one mood for very long. A serious conversation can be followed by an action sequence, and a dangerous situation can be followed by a joke. That keeps the movie lively, although sometimes the transitions are so quick that the emotional weight of one scene gets lost when the next one begins. Still, that energetic quality is part of what makes Sahara easy to watch. It rarely feels like the movie is struggling to find something to do. There is always another location, another clue, another problem, or another character to deal with. And despite all the criticism I can make about the screenplay, I think that momentum matters. Adventure movies live or die by how much they make you want to see what happens next. Sahara isn't perfect at that, but it succeeds often enough. The movie also has a surprisingly strong sense of optimism. Pitt isn't cynical about exploration. He genuinely enjoys discovering things, and that gives the story a positive energy even when the circumstances become dangerous. That optimism is probably one of the reasons McConaughey's casting works so well. His screen presence at this point in his career had exactly the kind of easy confidence the role needed. He could make Pitt feel larger than life without turning him into a completely unrealistic cartoon. Steve Zahn's performance keeps that confidence from becoming too polished, and Penélope Cruz brings seriousness when the story needs it. Together, they create a good balance between fun and danger. So while the movie has obvious weaknesses in its writing and some of its supporting characters, I think its strengths are becoming more apparent as the story develops. The cast is likable, The setting is visually interesting, the action has variety, and the central mystery gives everything a reason to keep moving. Most importantly, the movie understands that the audience doesn't need every part of the adventure to be realistic. They just need to believe that the characters are enjoying the journey and that the world around them has enough rules to make the danger matter. Sahara mostly manages that. It is exaggerated, sometimes overcrowded, and occasionally predictable, but it has enough charm to keep the adventure enjoyable. And at this point, the combination of the historical mystery and Eva's investigation gives the story enough weight that it feels like more than just Pitt looking for a lost ship. The movie is now moving toward the part where all of these different elements have to work together, and that is where the screenplay has its biggest challenge. It has spent a lot of time building separate pieces, so the payoff depends on whether those pieces can actually come together without making the story feel even more complicated. As Sahara moves deeper into its second half, the movie starts showing both sides of its personality more clearly. On one side, it is a fun adventure built around charismatic actors, desert locations, old mysteries, and big action sequences. On the other, it is trying to tell a story about a serious environmental and political problem. Most of the time those two sides work together, but there are moments when you can feel the movie switching between them rather than naturally combining them. That isn't necessarily a bad thing because the contrast is part of what makes the film different from a straightforward treasure hunt. Dirk Pitt's search for the lost ship gives the movie its adventurous side, while Eva's investigation gives it a more serious purpose. Matthew McConaughey and Penélope Cruz approach those two sides differently, and that helps keep the story balanced. McConaughey continues to be the perfect choice for Pitt because he doesn't allow the character to become too serious. Even when the situation around him is becoming dangerous, there is still a relaxed confidence in the way he talks and moves. That confidence is important because the movie would feel much heavier without it. At the same time, McConaughey doesn't completely ignore the seriousness of what is happening. Once Pitt understands that the situation involves more than a historical mystery, his attitude becomes more focused. He still has his humor, but there is more determination behind what he is doing. That change is subtle, which I prefer. Pitt doesn't suddenly become a completely different character just because the stakes have increased. He remains the same adventurous person, but his reasons for continuing become more important. Steve Zahn continues to be one of the most reliable parts of the film. Giordino's humor gives the movie some breathing room, especially when the story becomes complicated. Zahn knows how to play the jokes without making the character seem like he doesn't understand the danger around him. There is also a real sense of loyalty between Pitt and Giordino. That's one of the things I appreciate most about their relationship. Giordino doesn't follow Pitt because the screenplay needs a sidekick. He follows him because these two clearly trust each other. Their friendship also helps explain why Pitt is willing to take certain risks. He knows Giordino is capable of handling himself, and Giordino knows Pitt well enough to understand that trying to stop him completely probably isn't going to work. The movie's biggest advantage is that the friendship feels uncomplicated. There isn't a constant rivalry between them, and there isn't a moment where Giordino suddenly decides that Pitt is too reckless to follow. They have their arguments, but the underlying trust remains. Penelope Cruz's Eva becomes more important as the environmental storyline develops. She is dealing with something that isn't simply a personal mystery. The disease outbreak has consequences for a large number of people, and Cruz makes Eva's concern feel genuine. What works particularly well is that Eva isn't portrayed as someone who needs Pitt to rescue her emotionally. She is already committed to her work. Pitt becomes useful because of his particular skills and connections, but Eva has her own expertise. That makes their partnership more interesting because neither one completely controls the situation. Pitt understands exploration and dangerous environments, while Eva understands the medical problem. They need each other for different reasons. The romance between them is still not as strong as the friendship between Pitt and Giordino, but their differences give it enough personality. Pitt is naturally playful and confident, while Eva is more focused and serious. Their conversations have a little tension because they don't approach problems in exactly the same way. The screenplay does sometimes make their attraction feel too convenient. It is obvious that the movie wants these two characters to become romantically involved, so some of their interactions are written with that destination in mind. But McConaughey and Cruz have enough chemistry to make it work without becoming completely artificial. The environmental side of the story also changes the way we look at Pitt's treasure hunt. At first, the search for the ship is mostly about history and adventure. Later, it becomes connected to something much larger. That gives the historical mystery more importance because what Pitt discovers can potentially affect the present. I think this is where the movie's ambition becomes most obvious. It isn't satisfied with one simple adventure objective. It wants history, environmental danger, political conflict, romance, humor, and action all in the same story. Sometimes that combination works brilliantly. Sometimes it feels like too much. The strongest sections are the ones where the different elements naturally overlap. Pitt can investigate the historical mystery while also becoming involved in Eva's problem, and the action can emerge from the characters' objectives rather than appearing simply because the movie needs another action scene. The weaker sections are the ones where the story pauses to explain information that the audience could probably understand from context. The dialogue occasionally becomes overly direct, and some characters seem to explain things that they would realistically already know. This is one of the more obvious signs that the movie is based on a larger adventure story. There is a lot of information to fit into a 2-hour-plus runtime, and the screenplay sometimes has to deliver that information quickly. Still, the movie's visual storytelling helps. The locations communicate a lot without needing dialogue. When you see the characters moving through the desert, exploring old structures, or dealing with the harsh environment, you understand that their situation isn't simple. The desert also creates a natural sense of isolation. There are places where help isn't immediately available, and that makes even relatively simple problems more dangerous. The characters can't just call somebody and have a solution delivered. That physical limitation gives the action more weight. When something goes wrong with a vehicle or when the characters become trapped somewhere, the environment itself becomes part of the problem. The action sequences continue to be one of the movie's strongest entertainment factors. There is a good variety of movement, with vehicles and different environments being used rather than relying entirely on gunfights. I particularly like that the action usually feels connected to the adventure. Pitt isn't fighting simply because he's an action hero. He is usually trying to reach somewhere, escape from somebody, protect someone, or uncover something. That gives the sequences a purpose beyond spectacle. Of course, the realism is still questionable. Pitt survives situations that would probably leave an ordinary person seriously injured, and the movie occasionally asks the audience to accept some very convenient timing. But Sahara establishes its tone so clearly that these things are easier to accept than they would be in a serious thriller. The movie wants you to have fun, and that intention is obvious in almost every major sequence. The production design continues to support that feeling. The old ship and historical objects provide the movie with a tangible connection to the past. The modern vehicles and equipment provide the opposite, and the contrast makes the world feel larger. The cinematography also makes good use of the landscape. The wide shots give the film an epic feeling without requiring elaborate digital environments. There is something naturally impressive about seeing a character moving through such a huge landscape. The editing is generally quick, but it doesn't rely entirely on rapid cuts. The filmmakers allow some shots to establish where the characters are and what they are dealing with. That helps the action remain understandable. One thing I would have liked to see more of is the historical side of Pitt's personality. The movie establishes that he is fascinated by history, but it could have explored that interest more deeply. We understand that finding the lost ship matters to him, but we don't always get enough time to understand why that particular mystery means so much. McConaughey makes the obsession believable through his performance, but the screenplay could have given him more material to work with. Still, the character's enthusiasm is part of his charm. Pitt doesn't treat exploration like a boring job. He clearly enjoys the challenge, and that enthusiasm makes the adventure more fun. Giordino's presence also makes that enthusiasm easier to appreciate because he provides a more skeptical perspective. When Pitt becomes excited about a discovery, Giordino often brings the conversation back to practical concerns. I also think the film deserves credit for keeping Pitt and Eva as active participants rather than having one character completely take over the story. Their separate objectives eventually overlap, and both bring something important to the situation. The villains, however, remain less developed. Their actions create enough danger, but I don't think the movie gives us enough reason to become particularly interested in them as people. They are effective obstacles, but not especially memorable characters. That matters less because the movie's real emotional investment is elsewhere. We care about whether Pitt, Giordino, and Eva succeed. The villains mainly exist to make that success difficult. The music continues to support the adventure tone, although there are scenes where the score feels a little too eager to tell us that something important is happening. The quieter scenes usually work better because the actors can create the emotional atmosphere without as much assistance. That is true of the entire film, really. Whenever Sahara trusts its cast and locations, it feels natural. Whenever it tries too hard to explain its themes or force a reaction, it feels more like a conventional Hollywood production. But even with those weaknesses, the movie remains entertaining because there is genuine chemistry between the leads. McConaughey, Zahn, and Cruz make the journey feel lively, and the desert setting gives the whole thing a distinctive atmosphere. By this point, the film has also established that the historical mystery isn't simply going to remain a side adventure. It is tied closely enough to the larger problem that Pitt's personal interest has become part of something much more serious. That shift is important because it gives the movie a stronger reason to keep going. Pitt isn't just trying to prove that he can find something nobody else could find. He now has a reason to care about what happens after the discovery. And that is where Sahara becomes more than a simple treasure hunting movie. The adventure is still the main attraction, but the story has enough larger consequences to make the characters' choices matter. The movie isn't subtle about any of this, and I don't think it is trying to be. It wants the audience to understand the stakes clearly and then enjoy the ride. That approach works for me more often than it doesn't. Sahara may be overcrowded, but it is rarely boring. There is always another location, another discovery, another argument, or another problem waiting for the characters. And because Pitt, Giordino, and Eva remain likable throughout, the constant movement doesn't feel completely exhausting. You want to see how these three handle the next problem, even when you can predict that they will probably find some ridiculous way through it. By this point in Sahara, the movie has settled into the kind of adventure it was always aiming to be, but this is also where I think its biggest strengths and weaknesses become easier to see. The story has enough momentum that you rarely feel completely disconnected from it, yet the screenplay is carrying so many different ideas that some of them are naturally going to receive less attention than they deserve. Fortunately, the cast is strong enough to hold the whole thing together, and Matthew McConaughey in particular gives Dirk Pitt a personality that makes even the more exaggerated parts of the story easy to follow. What makes Pitt work for me is that McConaughey doesn't play him as an action hero who takes himself seriously. There is always a little bit of amusement in his performance, even when the circumstances become dangerous. Pitt seems like somebody who genuinely enjoys solving problems, especially when those problems involve history, exploration, or something that nobody else has been able to figure out. That curiosity gives him more personality than simply making him brave or physically capable. There is also something very old-fashioned about Pitt as a character. He belongs to the tradition of adventure heroes who are equally comfortable behind the wheel of a vehicle, underwater, in the middle of nowhere, or standing in front of some ancient discovery. The movie doesn't spend much time questioning whether he is too ambitious or too reckless. It simply accepts that this is who he is, and McConaughey makes that confidence entertaining instead of irritating. Steve Zahn remains an essential part of that formula. Giordino's role could have been reduced to comic relief, but Zahn gives him enough intelligence and experience to make the partnership believable. He isn't following Pitt around because he has nothing else to do. He is clearly capable himself, and the friendship between the two characters feels like something that existed long before the events of the movie. Their conversations also help the movie avoid becoming too self-important. There are plenty of serious things happening around them, but Pitt and Giordino can still joke with each other, argue over decisions, and react to the ridiculous situations they keep finding themselves in. Zahn has particularly good timing when he has to respond to one of Pitt's more reckless ideas, and those reactions often make the scenes more entertaining than the actual jokes written into the dialogue. The friendship is also important because it gives Pitt someone who can challenge him without creating unnecessary conflict. Giordino doesn't need to prove that he is smarter than Pitt. He can disagree with him and still trust him. That makes their relationship much more natural than the usual action movie partnership where two characters spend half the film competing with each other. Penélope Cruz's Eva brings a completely different energy to the group. She is more serious, more focused on the consequences of what is happening, and less interested in Pitt's adventurous personality. That difference gives the movie some balance. Without Eva, the story could easily become nothing more than Pitt and Giordino running around the desert looking for an old ship while making jokes. Eva's medical investigation gives the movie a reason to care about the people living in the region. Cruz doesn't play her as somebody who has all the answers, but she does give the character a strong professional identity. Eva knows what she is looking for and understands the seriousness of the situation, which makes her a useful counterpoint to Pitt's more instinctive approach. I also like the fact that Pitt doesn't suddenly become an expert in Eva's field just because the story needs him to. He has his own skills, and she has hers. Their partnership works because they bring different things to the situation. It is a simple idea, but it helps the characters feel more believable. The romantic relationship between Pitt and Eva is still one of the areas where the screenplay could have done more. There is chemistry between McConaughey and Cruz, and their screen presence works together, but the relationship doesn't always get enough time to develop naturally. The movie has so many other things happening that their attraction sometimes feels like another element that needs to be checked off rather than something that grows gradually. I don't think that hurts the overall movie too much because the adventure is clearly the priority, but it does mean that the romance isn't nearly as memorable as Pitt's friendship with Giordino. That friendship has history, personality, and a sense of trust that the romantic relationship doesn't quite reach. The larger environmental storyline also becomes more important around this point. The movie wants the audience to understand that what is happening isn't simply another adventure mystery. There are real consequences involved, and Eva's concern gives the story a human side beyond Pitt's personal interests. This part of the film is handled with a fairly straightforward approach. It doesn't spend a lot of time exploring complicated political ideas, and sometimes the villains are presented in a very simple way, but the basic message is easy to understand. The movie wants the audience to recognize that powerful people can make decisions that affect ordinary people who have very little control over what happens to them. That gives Pitt a more meaningful reason to get involved. He may have started out looking for something connected to the past, but his actions eventually become connected to the present. His curiosity becomes responsibility, even though he never completely stops being the adventurous character we met earlier. The desert remains one of the best parts of the movie visually. There is a real sense of openness in the locations, and the filmmakers make good use of the landscape for both quieter scenes and action. The wide shots make the characters seem small, while the closer scenes show how difficult it is to move through that environment. The physical setting also helps create a feeling of isolation. When the characters are far from cities and normal resources, even basic problems become serious. A damaged vehicle, lack of water, or being trapped in the wrong location can turn into a major problem. The movie uses those limitations well enough that the adventure never feels completely weightless. The production design works with the same idea. The historical elements have enough texture to make them interesting, and the old equipment and structures give the movie a sense that the characters are interacting with something that has genuinely survived from another time. This is particularly important for Pitt because his interest in history is one of the things that separates him from a generic action hero. He isn't just interested in fighting people or getting rich. He enjoys finding things that have been forgotten. McConaughey makes that enthusiasm believable, even though the screenplay could have explored it more deeply. The movie's action sequences also continue to benefit from the locations. Instead of putting every major set piece in a generic building, the filmmakers use the desert, roads, vehicles, and old structures to create variety. That makes the action more visually interesting. Some of the stunts are obviously exaggerated, and there are moments where Pitt's survival depends heavily on movie logic. But the film established this tone early, so I never expected strict realism. The important thing is that the action remains understandable and connected to the characters' objectives. That is something the movie generally handles well. Even when a sequence becomes large, you usually understand what Pitt and the others are trying to accomplish. They aren't just running around because the film needs explosions. There is normally a specific goal behind the action. The editing helps maintain the momentum, although it can also contribute to the feeling that the movie has too much material. Scenes move quickly, and sometimes a new development arrives before the previous one has had enough time to settle. A little more restraint in the screenplay would have made certain moments more effective. The dialogue has the same issue. Some conversations between the main characters feel natural because the actors have good chemistry, while other scenes sound like the screenplay is delivering information directly to the audience. Fortunately, the performances usually keep those moments from becoming completely artificial. McConaughey's delivery is especially useful because he can make fairly conventional adventure dialogue sound relaxed. Pitt rarely seems like he is reciting a speech. He talks as though he is simply thinking out loud or trying to convince someone to follow his plan. Zahn does the same thing in a different way. Giordino's reactions often make the dialogue feel more conversational because he doesn't always respond exactly as the screenplay might expect. His expressions and timing create the feeling that these characters are actually interacting rather than waiting for their next line. Cruz's performance is more controlled, which fits Eva. She isn't supposed to have the same playful personality as Pitt and Giordino, and her seriousness gives the movie a little more credibility when the story moves into its darker territory. The villains still remain a weak point for me. They create enough physical danger, but I don't think the movie gives them enough personality to become memorable. Their role is mainly functional. They have objectives that conflict with the heroes, and the plot uses them to create obstacles. That is a shame because a stronger villain could have given Pitt something more personal to fight against. The heroes are interesting because the actors give them distinctive personalities, while the antagonists are mostly defined by what they want rather than who they are. Even so, the movie doesn't fall apart because the central characters are strong enough. Pitt, Giordino, and Eva remain the reason I want to keep watching. Their interactions are more interesting than the conspiracy itself, and their personalities give the adventure some emotional consistency. I also think Sahara benefits from not taking itself too seriously. There are moments where the movie becomes almost ridiculous, but it never feels embarrassed about that. It is clearly trying to deliver a big, entertaining adventure in the tradition of older treasure hunting movies. The humor, locations, action, and historical mystery all fit that goal. The problem isn't that the movie is unrealistic. The problem is that sometimes it tries to do too many things at once. If the screenplay had been slightly more focused, the strongest elements could have had more impact. But even with that issue, the overall experience remains enjoyable. The movie has a sense of movement and personality that many technically polished action films don't have. You can see the imperfections, but you can also see why people enjoy watching it. For me, the biggest compliment I can give Sahara is that it feels like a movie made by people who wanted the audience to have fun. It doesn't spend the entire runtime trying to prove how intelligent or sophisticated it is. It gives you a charismatic hero, a loyal friend, an interesting female lead, a historical mystery, a huge desert setting, and plenty of danger, then lets those ingredients carry the adventure. Matthew McConaughey is at the center of all of it, and his performance keeps Pitt from becoming a generic action hero. He gives the character charm without making him completely perfect, confidence without making him unbearable, and enough humor to keep the heavier parts of the story from taking over. Steve Zahn makes the friendship believable, while Penelope Cruz provides the seriousness the story needs. Their combination is what allows Sahara to move between comedy, romance, action, and adventure without completely losing its identity. The movie still has a long way to go before everything reaches its conclusion, but by now its strengths are pretty clear. The story may be crowded, the villains could have been better written, and the romance could have been developed more naturally, but the cast and the adventure atmosphere carry a lot of the weight. If you go into Sahara expecting a realistic thriller, some of these choices will probably bother you. If you approach it as a big, old-fashioned adventure with a charismatic lead and a lot of personality, its strengths become much easier to appreciate. The movie knows what it wants to be, and even when it doesn't execute every part perfectly, it rarely loses that identity. At this stage, Sahara is at its most entertaining when it stops trying to explain itself and simply lets the characters and the adventure carry the movie. The basic premise has already been established, the main characters are familiar, and the different storylines are starting to overlap. What matters now is whether the film can turn all of that setup into something that feels satisfying rather than simply adding more complications. Matthew McConaughey continues to be the biggest reason the movie maintains its easygoing personality. Dirk Pitt could have been written as an arrogant treasure hunter who always has the answer, but McConaughey gives him enough humor and self-awareness to make that confidence enjoyable. Even when Pitt is clearly taking a huge risk, there is a sense that he understands what he is doing rather than simply being reckless for the sake of looking heroic. That distinction matters because the movie asks the audience to accept a lot from him. Pitt survives situations that would be extremely difficult for an ordinary person, but the performance makes his abilities feel like an established part of the character. He has experience, he knows how to improvise, and he doesn't panic easily. The film isn't trying to convince us that he is realistic in every detail. It wants us to believe that he is unusually capable. Steve Zahn's Giordino makes that easier to accept because he provides a more grounded reaction. When Pitt decides to do something dangerous, Giordino doesn't always understand why, but he trusts his friend enough to go along with him. Zahn's performance keeps the relationship from feeling like a standard hero and sidekick arrangement. There is real affection between them, and you can see that they have built their partnership over years of shared experiences. The humor between them also feels less forced than much of the movie's broader comedy. Their jokes come from knowing each other's personalities. Pitt knows exactly how Giordino is going to react, and Giordino knows Pitt well enough to recognize when he is about to do something completely unreasonable. That familiarity gives the movie a comfortable rhythm. Even when the plot becomes complicated, a conversation between these two can bring things back to something simple. They are friends first, adventurers second, and that relationship is one of the strongest parts of the film. Eva remains the serious center of the story. Penelope Cruz gives her enough determination to prevent her from being reduced to a romantic interest. She has a reason for being involved, and her concern about the disease outbreak keeps the story connected to something more serious than the historical mystery. The contrast between Eva and Pitt is particularly useful here. Pitt is fascinated by what has been lost in the past, while Eva is focused on what is happening in the present. He wants to uncover something hidden, while she wants to understand a problem that is affecting living people. Their interests are different, but the story gradually shows how those interests can intersect. Cruz also brings a calmer quality to the film. McConaughey and Zahn have a lot of energy between them, so Eva's more controlled personality gives the movie some balance. When she is involved in a scene, the focus often shifts toward the consequences of what is happening rather than the excitement of the adventure itself. The romance between Pitt and Eva still feels somewhat secondary, but at least it doesn't completely take over the story. Their relationship develops alongside the main conflict instead of replacing it. I think that is the right choice for this movie because the adventure is much more interesting than a conventional romantic storyline would have been. The environmental element also gives the film more weight. Without it, the search for the lost ship would mostly be a fun historical puzzle. With Eva's investigation connected to it, the discovery starts carrying consequences that affect more than Pitt's personal interests. The movie doesn't explore those consequences with the depth of a serious political thriller, and I don't think it is trying to. It keeps the subject accessible so that it can remain an adventure movie. That means some of the villains and political elements feel simplified, but the central idea still works. One of the things I appreciate is that the movie never completely abandons its original sense of discovery. Even when the stakes become higher, there is still a feeling that Pitt is uncovering something that has been hidden for a long time. The historical mystery gives the movie its identity. The visual presentation continues to support that. The desert landscapes give the film an epic scale, while the historical locations and objects make the adventure feel connected to something older. The contrast between ancient history and modern technology is visually appealing. The cinematography is not always flashy, but it doesn't need to be. The locations themselves provide enough visual interest. The filmmakers understand that a huge desert landscape can create a sense of scale without constantly adding visual effects. The action sequences also benefit from this approach. When vehicles move across the desert, the open environment gives the audience a clear idea of speed and distance. There is enough space for the action to breathe instead of being hidden behind constant close-ups. That doesn't mean every sequence is perfectly realistic. Some stunts are clearly designed around entertainment rather than physics, and Pitt's ability to survive keeps reaching the limits of what you would normally accept. But again, the movie has established that its hero is unusually capable, so the exaggerated action fits the tone. The biggest issue is still the screenplay's tendency to add more information when it could simply let the existing conflict develop. There are moments where the movie seems determined to remind us of every part of the story, even though the audience already understands the basic situation. That can make certain scenes feel less natural. The actors usually handle them well, but you can sense the writing underneath the performance. This is where I think the difference between the actors and the screenplay becomes obvious. The cast often makes the material feel more believable than it actually is. McConaughey can take a conventional line and deliver it casually. Zahn can make exposition feel like a conversation. Cruz can bring seriousness to material that might otherwise feel too obvious. That isn't easy for actors to do, and it is one of the reasons the movie remains watchable despite its weaknesses. The villains don't benefit from the same advantage because their characterization is thinner. They are mostly there to oppose the heroes, and their scenes sometimes feel like they exist only to move the plot forward. A stronger villain would have given the movie another memorable personality, but the main trio still carries most of the emotional weight. I also think the movie could have spent more time exploring Pitt's relationship with the historical mystery itself. He is clearly fascinated by it, but the screenplay treats that fascination more as a personality trait than as something deeply personal. There are opportunities to make the discovery mean more to him, but the story is usually in too much of a hurry to take advantage of them. Still, the adventure atmosphere remains strong enough to compensate. There is something satisfying about watching characters search through old places, follow clues, travel through dangerous environments, and slowly realize that the thing they are looking for is connected to a much bigger problem. That structure is familiar, but familiarity isn't necessarily a weakness. Adventure stories work because audiences enjoy the feeling of discovery. The question is whether the movie can make the journey entertaining, and Sahara generally does. Another thing that helps is the movie's sense of humor. It doesn't always land, but there is enough of it to keep the tone light. Pitt and Giordino don't behave like people trapped inside a grim thriller. They still have personalities, and that makes the movie feel more like a fun adventure than a serious survival story. The film's age is noticeable in some of the humor and certain character dynamics, but I wouldn't say that completely hurts the experience. In some ways, that dated quality is part of what makes the movie feel like a product of its era. It has the confidence and scale of early 2000s studio adventure movies. The visual effects also show their age in places, but the practical elements help. Real locations, vehicles, sets, and physical environments give the movie a texture that pure digital filmmaking sometimes struggles to create. The desert photography is especially effective because it gives the film an identity beyond the plot. Even if you removed some of the story elements, the image of these characters moving through such a huge landscape would still communicate what kind of movie this is. There is also a nice contrast between the openness of the environment and the claustrophobic moments inside old structures or vehicles. The movie can move from a huge landscape to a confined space and use that change to create different kinds of tension. That variety is important in a movie this long. If every scene looked and felt the same, the adventure would become exhausting. Instead, the filmmakers keep changing the environment and the type of problem the characters face. The central trio remains the constant through all of it. Pitt is the adventurous leader, Giordino is the loyal and funny partner, and Eva is the serious professional whose investigation gives the story a larger purpose. None of them is perfect, and that is probably for the best. Pitt is reckless, Giordino can be skeptical, and Eva can be overly focused on the problem in front of her. Those differences give them room to interact rather than simply agreeing with one another. The more the story brings them together, the more natural the group feels. It becomes less about separate characters pursuing separate objectives and more about three people who have found themselves involved in the same increasingly dangerous situation. That is where the movie becomes most enjoyable for me. The plot may be complicated, but the characters are easy to understand. You know why Pitt keeps pushing forward, why Giordino stays with him, and why Eva refuses to stop investigating. The stakes are also becoming clearer. The historical mystery matters, but what it reveals matters even more. The adventure is no longer just about finding something lost. It is about understanding what that discovery means for the present situation. That gives the final stretch of the movie something to build toward. I wouldn't call Sahara a particularly deep film, and I don't think it needs to be. Its appeal comes from its energy, cast, locations, and old-fashioned adventure structure. The movie works best when it embraces those strengths instead of trying to become something more complicated. There are definitely parts one would have changed. The screenplay could have been tighter, the villains could have had more personality, and the romance could have developed more naturally. But those problems don't erase the fact that the movie has a lot of charm. McConaughey is clearly having fun with Pitt, Zahn is a great partner for him, and Cruz gives the story enough seriousness to stop it from becoming completely weightless. The result is uneven but entertaining. At this point, the movie has done enough to establish its identity. It isn't trying to reinvent the adventure genre. It is simply taking the familiar ingredients and giving them a large desert setting, a historical mystery, and a charismatic lead point. One of the things that becomes more noticeable as Sahara approaches its final stretch is how much the movie depends on momentum. The story has already introduced its historical mystery, the environmental crisis, the political conflict, and the relationship between Pitt, Giordino, and Eva. At this point, the film doesn't need to keep introducing new ideas. It needs to bring the existing ones together, and this is where the adventure becomes more focused. Dirk Pitt works best in this part because his personality is finally being tested by something bigger than his own curiosity. Earlier, he was mostly driven by the excitement of discovery. He wanted to find something that had been lost and prove that his instincts were right. Now the situation has become much more serious, and McConaughey adjusts the performance without changing Pitt completely. He still has the same confidence, but there is more urgency behind his decisions. That balance is important. If Pitt suddenly became completely serious, the character would lose the personality that made him enjoyable in the first place. McConaughey instead lets the seriousness appear underneath the charm. Pitt is still willing to make jokes and take risks, but he understands that people are depending on him now. That gives his actions more meaning than they had earlier. Steve Zahn continues to make Giordino feel like a genuine partner rather than a side character who happens to be present during the adventure. His relationship with Pitt is probably the most naturally developed relationship in the movie. There is trust between them, but there is also enough disagreement to make their conversations believable. Giordino doesn't blindly follow every decision Pitt makes, and Pitt doesn't treat him as somebody who needs constant instructions. That dynamic becomes especially useful when the situation gets more dangerous. Giordino knows Pitt well enough to understand what he is likely to do, and Pitt knows that Giordino will be there when things become difficult. Zahn's performance keeps the friendship grounded even when the plot itself becomes increasingly exaggerated. Eva's role also becomes more connected to the central conflict. Penélope Cruz gives the character a serious determination that helps the environmental side of the story maintain some weight. The movie could easily have turned Eva into a character whose only purpose was to provide information or create a romantic connection with Pitt, but Cruz keeps her focused on the problem she came to investigate. That is one of the better choices in the screenplay. Eva doesn't suddenly abandon her own priorities because she has become interested in Pitt. She still cares about the people affected by the crisis, and her professional knowledge remains important. Pitt may be the person who can physically get them into places other people cannot reach, but Eva understands why they need to be there. The combination of these three characters is what makes the final section work. Pitt brings the adventurous instinct, Giordino brings practical experience and humor, and Eva brings the seriousness of the situation. They don't always approach problems in the same way, but their different strengths complement one another. The environmental storyline itself is fairly straightforward, but I think that works better than if the movie had tried to turn it into a complicated political thriller. Sahara is ultimately an adventure movie, and the environmental crisis gives the adventure a purpose without completely changing its tone. The message is clear enough without becoming the only thing the movie wants to discuss. The historical mystery also gains more value because of its connection to the present. Pitt's fascination with the past isn't just a random hobby anymore. What he finds becomes part of a much larger chain of events, and that makes the discovery feel more important. This is where the production design becomes particularly useful. The old historical elements give the movie a physical connection to its mystery. The story isn't built entirely around people talking about something that happened long ago. The characters are actually searching through places and objects connected to that history, which makes the mystery easier to become invested in. Visually, the film continues to benefit from the desert. The wide landscapes give the adventure a large scale, while the more confined locations create a different kind of tension. The contrast keeps the movie from looking visually repetitive. I also think the action works better when it is connected to the environment. The desert gives the filmmakers opportunities for vehicle sequences, long-distance movement, and dangerous situations that would feel different in a city. The setting becomes part of the adventure rather than simply being a background. Some of the action is still exaggerated, but by now that is part of the movie's identity. Pitt is clearly operating at a level above an ordinary person, and the film wants the audience to enjoy that rather than question every physical detail. The important thing is that the sequences are easy to follow and that the characters have understandable objectives. The biggest weakness remains the villains. Even as the story reaches its more serious stages, I still don't think the antagonists have enough personality. They create danger, but they don't have the same screen presence as Pitt, Giordino, or Eva. The movie spends more time making us care about what the heroes are trying to accomplish than making us understand the people standing against them. That makes the conflict feel more functional than personal. The heroes need to stop them because they are causing serious problems, but there isn't much emotional history between the two sides. A more developed antagonist could have made the final confrontation much stronger. Still, the movie doesn't completely depend on the villain for tension. The circumstances themselves provide enough pressure. The characters have limited time, difficult terrain, and increasingly dangerous obstacles. Even without a particularly complex antagonist, there is enough happening to keep the story moving. The chemistry between the actors also helps maintain that momentum. McConaughey and Zahn have the easiest relationship in the movie, while McConaughey and Cruz provide a different kind of energy. Cruz's more serious approach prevents Pitt from dominating every scene with humor, and that gives the movie some variety. The romance still feels like the least developed part of the main character relationships, but I don't think it damages the overall experience. The movie is much more successful as an adventure than as a love story, and it is better when it focuses on that strength. What I appreciate most about this section is that Pitt's personality hasn't been abandoned just because the stakes have become higher. He is still the same character who became interested in the mystery because he loves discovering things. The difference is that he now understands that the discovery has consequences. That gives McConaughey a little more emotional material to work with. Pitt isn't simply chasing another exciting story. He has become personally involved in the outcome, and the performance communicates that without becoming overly dramatic. The film also maintains its sense of humor during the more serious sections. I think that is important because without those lighter moments, the movie could become much heavier than its basic adventure tone can support. Giordino is especially useful here because Zahn can bring some personality into scenes that might otherwise become too serious. At the same time, the humor doesn't completely erase the danger. The movie usually knows when to let a situation remain serious, which keeps the stakes from becoming meaningless. By this point, Sahara feels like a movie that knows exactly what kind of entertainment it wants to provide. It isn't aiming for realism, subtle political analysis, or deep character psychology. It is aiming for a big adventure with charismatic actors and enough mystery to keep the audience interested. That approach won't work for everyone, especially if you expect a more grounded action thriller. But if you accept the movie on its own terms, there is a lot to enjoy. The cast has good chemistry, the locations look great, the action has variety, and the story has enough moving parts to keep things interesting. The final stretch is where those elements finally have to pay off, and the movie is at its strongest when it stays focused on the characters rather than trying to explain every detail. Pitt, Giordino, and Eva are the reason the story matters, and their performances keep the adventure from feeling empty. The closer Sahara gets to its conclusion, the more obvious it becomes that the movie's real strength was never the complexity of its story. The plot has plenty of moving pieces, but the reason the film remains entertaining is much simpler. It has a lead actor who fits the role extremely well, a supporting cast with good chemistry, a strong adventure setting, and enough action to keep the story moving. Once the film reaches this stage, those qualities become more important than whether every part of the screenplay works perfectly. Matthew McConaughey continues to carry the movie comfortably as Dirk Pitt. What I like about his performance is that he doesn't suddenly become a different character when the danger increases. Pitt is still confident and occasionally playful, but there is more seriousness underneath him now because the situation has become personal. McConaughey doesn't need to give the character a dramatic transformation. A change in his attitude and delivery is enough to show that Pitt understands the consequences of what is happening. That makes the character easier to root for. Pitt isn't trying to save the world because he suddenly wants to be a traditional hero. He became involved because of his curiosity and his desire to uncover the truth, and eventually he realizes that the discovery has consequences for other people. The motivation grows naturally from his personality. Steve Zahn remains just as important. Giordino is one of those supporting characters who could easily have been written as nothing more than the funny friend, but Zahn gives him enough presence that he feels essential to Pitt's journey. His reactions make Pitt more believable because somebody has to respond to all the risks Pitt takes. The friendship between them is also one of the most convincing parts of the film. They don't need long emotional conversations to establish that they care about each other. Their behavior makes it obvious. Giordino stays when things become dangerous, Pitt trusts him with difficult situations, and neither one constantly questions the other's loyalty. That kind of relationship fits the adventure genre perfectly because it gives the action a little more emotional weight. When one of them is in danger, it matters because we have already spent enough time seeing how they work together. Penelope Cruz's Eva continues to provide the more serious perspective. Her investigation gives the story a reason to matter beyond Pitt's personal adventure, and Cruz plays that responsibility with enough restraint. She doesn't need to become overly emotional in every scene to communicate that the situation is serious. I think this is also where the difference between the three main performances becomes especially useful. McConaughey brings charm, Zahn brings humor and loyalty, while Cruz brings focus and seriousness. The movie can move between different moods because the actors aren't all playing the same type of character. The environmental storyline isn't handled with enormous subtlety, but it does give the final stages some purpose. The danger isn't simply something Pitt and the others have to escape from. There are people who could be affected by the outcome, and that makes their efforts more meaningful. The historical mystery also feels more satisfying because it has become part of the larger conflict. Pitt's interest in the past initially seems like a personal obsession, but the discovery eventually becomes important to the present. That connection gives the adventure a stronger structure than a simple search for treasure. Visually, the movie continues to make good use of the desert and its surroundings. The wide landscapes give the film an almost classic adventure feeling, while the more confined locations allow the filmmakers to create a different kind of tension. The contrast keeps the movie from becoming visually repetitive. The action sequences remain exaggerated, but they are also energetic. There is a clear sense of movement, and the filmmakers use vehicles and physical environments instead of relying entirely on digital effects. Some effects are more convincing than others, especially when viewed today, but the overall spectacle still works because the movie is committed to its adventurous tone. One thing I appreciate is that the action generally has a purpose. Pitt isn't simply fighting because the movie needs a fight. He is usually trying to reach something, escape from somebody, protect another character, or prevent a larger problem. That connection keeps the set pieces from feeling completely disconnected from the story. The weakest part continues to be the antagonists. They are dangerous enough, but they don't have the personality required to become memorable villains. Their actions create obstacles, but the audience doesn't get the same sense of character that we get from Pitt, Giordino, or Eva. That makes the conflict less emotionally complicated than it could have been. The movie is basically asking us to support the heroes and oppose the villains, without spending much time exploring the motivations on the other side. Fortunately, Sahara isn't relying on psychological complexity to keep the audience interested. The adventure itself provides most of the entertainment. There are enough discoveries, dangers, and changes in location to keep the story moving toward its conclusion. The screenplay still has moments where it tries to explain too much. Some information is repeated, and certain conversations feel more like they are designed to remind the audience what is happening rather than allowing the characters to speak naturally. These moments aren't disastrous, but they do make the movie feel more conventional. The performances help hide that weakness. McConaughey has a relaxed delivery that makes even obvious dialogue feel less artificial, while Zahn's reactions create the impression of spontaneous conversation. Cruz brings enough seriousness to keep the more important scenes from becoming lightweight. The romantic side of the story remains functional rather than exceptional. There is chemistry between Pitt and Eva, but the movie doesn't develop their relationship with the same care it gives the friendship between Pitt and Giordino. Their attraction is believable enough for this type of film, but it isn't the emotional center. And honestly, I think that's fine. The movie is much better when it is focused on exploration, danger, and the partnership between the characters. The romance adds another layer, but it isn't what makes Sahara memorable. What does make it memorable is the atmosphere. There is something appealing about the combination of desert landscapes, historical mysteries, old machinery, vehicles, and adventurous characters. The film creates a world that feels larger than the immediate plot. That atmosphere also gives the movie a certain nostalgic quality. It feels like the kind of big studio adventure that was designed to be watched for entertainment rather than analyzed endlessly. It wants to take the audience somewhere unusual and keep them there for a couple of hours. That doesn't mean the film is flawless. There are obvious problems with the writing, pacing, villains, and some of the character development. But the movie has enough personality that those weaknesses don't completely overwhelm its strengths. McConaughey's casting was particularly important. Dirk Pitt needs to be charismatic enough that the audience is willing to follow him through increasingly ridiculous situations, and McConaughey has exactly that quality. He doesn't need to force the charm because it is already part of his screen presence. Zahn was also a smart choice because he gives the film an entirely different rhythm. If Pitt were surrounded by characters who were equally confident and serious, the movie could become tiring. Giordino gives him somebody to bounce off, and that makes the adventure more enjoyable. Cruz adds the necessary seriousness, particularly when the story deals with the environmental consequences. Her presence reminds the audience that there is something more important happening beneath all the action. The result is an uneven but genuinely entertaining adventure. It isn't a movie I would describe as perfectly written, but I can understand why someone would come back to it simply because it is fun to watch. As the conclusion gets closer, the biggest question isn't whether the movie will suddenly become something completely different. It has already established its style. The real question is whether all these different storylines can reach a satisfying ending without becoming too crowded. So far, the film has done enough to make me care about the characters and understand what they are trying to accomplish. That is more important than having a perfectly constructed plot. And that is probably the best way to judge Sahara. It works less as a tightly written thriller and more as a charismatic, old-fashioned adventure that happens to have a lot going on. When the movie leans into that identity, it is at its best. After watching Sahara, I think the easiest way to describe it is as a big, old-fashioned adventure movie that is much more enjoyable when you don't expect it to be completely realistic or perfectly written. It has a complicated story, but the appeal isn't really in how complicated that story is. The appeal comes from the characters, the locations, the mystery, and the feeling that you're going on an adventure with people who actually enjoy what they're doing. Matthew McConaughey is easily the biggest reason the movie works. Dirk Pitt could have been an annoying character because he is confident, reckless, and usually convinced that he can find a way out of whatever situation he gets himself into. But McConaughey gives him enough charm and humor that Pitt becomes easy to follow. He doesn't feel like a superhero. He feels more like an extremely experienced adventurer who happens to be very comfortable taking risks. Steve Zahn is another major strength. Giordino gives Pitt somebody to interact with, and their friendship feels much more natural than the typical action movie partnership. Zahn knows when to be funny and when to let the seriousness of the situation take over. Their chemistry gives the movie some of its most enjoyable moments. Penélope Cruz brings a different energy as Eva. Her character gives the story a more serious purpose because her investigation is connected to a problem affecting ordinary people. Cruz doesn't overplay the role, and that helps keep the environmental storyline from becoming completely disconnected from the adventure. The movie's biggest weakness is probably the screenplay. There are simply too many things happening at once, and some elements could have been developed much better if the story had been more focused. The villains in particular could have been stronger because they don't have the same personality or depth as the main characters. The romance between Pitt and Eva is also fine without being particularly memorable. There is chemistry between the actors, but the relationship doesn't receive enough development to become one of the strongest parts of the film. The friendship between Pitt and Giordino feels much more convincing. Where Sahara really succeeds is in its atmosphere. The desert locations, historical mystery, vehicles, old structures, and adventure sequences give the movie a personality that many modern action films don't have. It feels like a movie made to entertain first, and that gives it a certain charm. The action is exaggerated, but that fits the tone. This isn't a realistic survival movie where every injury and decision has to make perfect sense. It is an adventure where the hero gets into impossible situations and somehow finds a way through them. Once you accept that, the movie becomes much easier to enjoy. I also think the film benefits from its cast being willing to have fun with the material. McConaughey doesn't treat Pitt like a deeply serious dramatic character, Zahn brings energy to every scene, and Cruz gives the story enough seriousness to keep everything from becoming pure comedy. So no, Sahara isn't a perfect movie. The writing could be tighter, the villains could be more memorable, and some of the storylines could have been developed with more depth. But despite those problems, it has something important that many technically better movies don't have: personality. If you're looking for a realistic action thriller, this probably isn't the movie for you. But if you want a fun adventure with a charismatic lead, good chemistry, beautiful desert locations, mystery, action, and a classic treasure hunting feel, Sahara is an easy movie to recommend. For me, that's ultimately what makes it enjoyable. It doesn't need to be perfect to be entertaining. It just needs to take you along for the ride, and Sahara does that pretty well. Final rating, 7 out of 10. And that's my take on Sahara. It's not a perfect adventure movie, but it has enough action, humor, mystery, and great chemistry between the cast to make it a fun watch. If you enjoyed the movie, let me know your rating in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more movie reviews. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.